I'm going to ask Linda a couple of questions, ones that really are, well, I don't know who's read the book, but really these are kind of questions for my own benefit, because I'm fascinated by the book. I continue to be, and these are questions that I was excited to come up with, because they were things I was genuinely interested to find out. So some of these questions might lead to answers that you're already aware of, others might not, but we'll leave that open for the Q&A at the end for anything else people might be interested to ask about. So the first thing I wanted to ask you about, Linda, was the very unique origins of the book. So for anyone who doesn't know already, Linda published an essay about it for International Women's Day, but this book is over 20 years, I think, in the making, which is an awfully long time for what is at this stage, quite a modest size book. And it has its origins in a couple of articles from the Perthshire Advertiser that I think are almost over 100 years old. So I'd wonder if you'd like to talk a little bit more about the beginnings of this, the inspiration behind it, and how it developed over that long period.
Yeah, sure. I mean, I do hasten to add that I haven't actually been working on it full time for 20 years, in case anyone's worried about me. But I did actually start writing what was to be my first novel almost exactly 20 years ago. And the impetus actually initially was because I'd been told that I had to write a novel. I'd had my first book of short stories published, which was Life Drawing, which had the story that Patrick kindly mentioned in it. I was told that unless I wrote a novel, I wouldn't be taken seriously by publishers or readers or whatever. But actually, my heart was really with short stories. I felt like a short story writer. I'd fallen into it very naturally. But anyway, off I went, and I thought, right, what am I going to write a novel about? I didn't even know how to go about it. And I think the initial thing, before the Perthshire Advertiser articles appeared before me, the initial thing was that I had thought of a post-industrial building which was being converted to flats. And I liked the idea that that might give quite a lot of promise for hidden stories, the history of the building, things that had happened there. Not as anything like as strong as a haunting, but a sense of resonance from a past life, which wasn't residential. And I didn't hit straight away upon the idea of a woolen mill, but I'd actually worked on a woolen mill being converted post-industrially to a museum as my first job. So I did know quite a lot about what the inside of a woolen mill might be like. But initially it was only going to be in the current time period. And then I was looking for what might have happened in the past in Perthshire Advertisers and other archives in the library in Perth. And I was completely distracted by a story that came up, a number of stories, but the first one that attracted me was the story of a man who was suing his wife for divorce in 1914 in Kinlochranach. He was a road maker in Kinlochranach, which is, as local people know, only about 10 miles away from here, a bit further north, and a very small place. And the reason that he was doing it, she'd gone off to Canada, having abandoned him when he refused permission for her to train as a nurse. Because actually in that period, and I didn't know this, a married woman couldn't take a job without her husband's permission, and it had to be by signature. So he wouldn't give his permission. So she did various things according to him. There was a very extended article in the Perthshire Advertiser about how she started reading Tolstoy. And she became a suffragette, and she actually moved house, and she stopped cooking for him, all these terrible things. And I was so taken by this story, and the fact that he'd found the money to sue her for divorce. That's quite, divorce was very unusual then. Anyway, so I was sort of hooked, but I thought, this is irrelevant, I shouldn't distract myself. But then I kept on looking, and then I came across, I thought immediately, what on earth would it be like to be a suffragette in a tiny village, really? And having been a bit involved myself in the women's peace movement back in the 80s, I knew how important it was to have the camaraderie and the sense of support around you. And if you didn't have that, I think, you know, that would be quite a hard movement to keep supporting. Anyway, so an idea for a character began to emerge from that, even though I was kept saying no, no. And there were these two other headlines about the Perthshire Cricket Pavilion being burnt to the ground by suffragettes, and 3 mansions in Strathern being burnt to the ground. Things that I had no idea about. You know, I had no idea that there was Perthshire had been any kind of focus for the suffragette movement. And then once you start looking, you find that there were lots of meetings and gatherings, and that such a character from a remote village could have got to, actually, but the public transport seemed to be better then than it is now in rural areas. Catherine, the character of Catherine, who's central to this book, she's the one who reappears, just made herself available to me. I don't know where she came from, really. And her story, because I'd been reading up about industrial unrest, because I thought that the history in the background was going to be something to do with industrial unrest. I'd read a bit about Red Clydeside, and particularly the cotton mills in Paisley. And there'd been, in 1911, I think it was, there was a very successful action by 5,000 mill lassies who came out on strike, and the mill ground to a halt, and they pretty much stormed the building. They had the foreman hiding in a railway station in terror, and then they burned an effigy of him, you know, so it was all sort of pretty hot stuff. But they were successful, and you know what had happened is they were doing the work of they were doing more unpaid work by an extra machine being slipped into their watch. But they were successful, and that was the beginning of unionisation there. So I knew that there was that sort of background to her, that's how she'd met her husband. But then he went back to the village that he came from because he was offered a job as a weaver in the mill. And then the story sort of began to build out of that, of a stronger past than I'd expected, particularly when I realised that she was sitting outside the mill speaking to it. And that was sort of the moment that she really took over, was her voice, her insistent voice. So then I had I had a story in the present time about an architect, and I had this past story. But over the years, I mean, that was going to be the novel, and I wrote loads of millions of drafts of it. I've got boxes and boxes of the drafts of that, which never saw the light of day. But over the years, I've written stories with the same setting from different periods, never really thinking of it as a collection, although I suppose that must have been there in the back of my mind. And you know, realised that the story that I thought of as contemporary about the architect was no longer contemporary. You know, it was back in 2006. I realised I had to write a later one. And so that's how it's now got this stretch from 1831 to 2019. And it wasn't engineered, the kind of way that they hang together wasn't engineered all that much, but I think it was the pivotal central focus of the building and Catherine's story kind of mesh it together in a way that's unexpected even to me. Sorry, that was a very long-winded answer for a short question.
Oh no, it's great. It's great. I mean, I wonder about this this question of the structure. I mean, you spoke about how the short story was your first love, and were uncomfortable even with the idea of writing a novel. Know how to really in a way, you know. So and how it's one of the most kind of striking things about this book, I think, is the form of it. I mean, they are interlinked short stories, but it's a cohesive whole. It's a novella. It's a short novel as well, and it seems to very successfully blend between genres and forms. I wonder if you could talk a little bit about the short story form and the unique benefits or the unique kind of significance of it as a storytelling form, and how it relates, how it's especially important to this story.
I think Richard Ford said of the short story that it's the high wire act of literature, which I do sort of subscribe to, that it can very easily go wrong, you know, and I think that's partly because it depends as much on what you don't say as what you do say in it. And I found myself to be quite a concise writer. In fact, if anything, I tend to miss out important things and people have to tell me to add things in. So it seemed to suit me as a form, and I like the fact that for me, short stories often arrive very intuitively, and there's a great sense of instinct and coincidence that you're thinking about something, and then the perfect bit of information that you need in that story seems to come along when you need it. There's obviously a lot of reworking, which is much more cerebral. You know, there's these two parts of the writer who work together, the intuitive part and the more orderly cerebral part. But short stories seem to me to come from somewhere quite deep and instinctive. Whereas a novel, I mean, I try to write novels in the same way, but they have to have a concept behind them, really. And I would say that this book, I didn't have a strong, the way it's ended up now in this form, there's probably a concept there now, but I didn't write it to a concept. It arises through this sort of integration of the stories and the timelines. So I wouldn't say it's accidental. I'd hate to say it's completely accidental, but you know, some of it is just having had that strong sense of a number of characters, the place, and then the mesh of the others has kind of bound it together.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, that was one of the things, I don't know how other people who have read the book feel, but that was one of the kind of formal aspects of it that immediately struck me. The kind of the architectonics of it. You know, it felt architectural in a way that felt almost self-referential. This focus of the book being a mill. You know, there's almost this each individual stone that comes together to build a building. There are all these little stories that separate amount to nothing, but when placed together amount to overarching structure. I think that there's also this interesting kind of blend of the personal and the political going on. I mean, you were speaking there earlier about when you were speaking about the origins of the book, and there seemed to be these two very distinct strands. So there was your own personal experiences of experiencing a mill, a disused mill when you were younger, and also being a part of the women's peace movement, and very personal stories blended with these much broader moments of Red Clydeside and broader political movements. And that seems to be something, again, that's running throughout this book, I find. You know, it's this blending of very intensely personal with the broader political. I think that the form lends itself to that with short stories. You have little snapshots in people's lives. It's got very intimate personal snapshots, but when placed together form this grand narrative. And I just wondered about this personal side of this, especially. I mean, I might be wrong, correct me if I am, but is this the first book that you've written about Perthshire or set in Perthshire? Is that correct?
Yes, I suppose it is. Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, I've written non-fiction in Perthshire.
Sure.
I think it's. Yeah, I guess there might have been some short story. I'd have to think. Actually, I think they've got at least one short story which is not part of this, but which is set in Perthshire. Maybe more, but. Yeah, it's the focus on Perthshire. I mean, one thing that's unusual about it is that my last novel, Call of the Undertow, which was set in coastal Caithness, was very much set in a specific place. Although I renamed it, it's very much a location, and the novel arose from my wanderings and explorings of us, which was used very thoroughly in the novel. And actually, the place in The Other Side of Stone I've made it up, you know, and it's a sort of amalgam of bits and pieces of different villages. This woolen mill never existed, but I could draw on, in Aberfeldy, there's a smaller woolen mill, which had quite, you know, an interesting history, being a mill that wasn't part of the main geographical locations for woolen mills in the Borders or in Yorkshire. a bit out on its own, which is how it came not to be strongly unionised. So I had that to draw on, I had the landscape to draw on, and obviously, you know, I'm walking all the time. I'm sort of, I can't help walking, walk. And that's very much part of my writing process. So inevitably, I'm bringing Perthshire observation into it, even though I've invented it. But I did also, you know, I'm a bit like a method actor. I'm a method writer, so I did go to Selkirk and Galashiels and visit some woolen mills. And for the first story, which is about the stonemason who makes the dedication stone above the door, you know, I was fortunate to be able to go and visit and talk to a local stonemason here, who showed me all the tools and how he would go about, and gave me the language, if you like, of a stonemason. So that's all very much part of my process, and I always find it interesting.
Yeah, no, I mean, it's absolutely evident in the book. You know, there's this real rich feeling of research. You know, research. You can tell that this is not just a story that you've read about, or that you've read about these movements, or read about these places, but the places that you've walked through, experienced. You know, it's very rich in sensory detail, and there's a real kind of what I would maybe call kind of embodied writing. It's not to say it's not cerebral, but there's a very strong physicality.
Should I read a bit from the stonemason story? Would this be a good time to do that?
That would be great. Yeah.
Yeah. So I'll just read it's the opening of the book for those who well, whether you've read it or not, which is 1831. And this story is called Stone Curse, and this is the opening as the stonemason is at work. Some days it's just the wee fellow who watches me. I see him through the hazel arch of the workshop when I turn my head, and he's there when I take my tools out to the forge to be licked sharp in the flames. He perches on the top of the rubble pile or on a post and observes. A smart looker he is, with his white collar and chestnut stomach. Out of his dark face comes a scolding cry when there's someone coming. He's an unquiet bird then, with his clack, 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 for all as if he's bashing two stones together. If the women hear him when they turn their backs, pull their caps over their cheeks like blinkers, wondering who the rotted will fall upon. Will it be your father who wakes up blind? I tease them as they go by. Or your man that falls from a crag and loses the use of his legs? Or maybe the leg in between will drop off. It's not for a man of my age to be feared of a bird the size of my thumb. And the fellow's my friend, is he not? He's my steady companion, watching me force the chisel upon this rock that's so brute hard, my scours and draughts will be there to see for centuries to come.
Brilliant. One of the really powerful aspects of that first chapter is it's I mean, this is true really of all of them, but for me in that first chapter, because it's a period of time I suppose I'm unfamiliar with, is the really strong sense of culture and tradition that you have, you know, and it's brought to life in a very vivid way, not just necessarily through the kind of reference to myths and cultural beliefs, but just the interactions with these characters. I don't know if again, for anyone who's read the book, but there's a little foreshadowing in that first chapter about the apple tree, the orchard, which then links forward to the apple tree that will be planted in the final chapter. Spoiler alert, I'm afraid I didn't think about that. But this kind of interlinking of past and present, and finding connections between past and present, you know, suggesting that there isn't just a linear line of progress, but that there's constant back and forth, and that there's learning to be had from previous cultures. I mean, this is a really strong element, something that really resonates with me. And I wonder, but for you, how how important this exploration of other cultures and other belief systems is as a writer, to kind of expand beyond just your own experience or the experience of your own age, let's say, of time. And also how, above and beyond literature, how realistic or possible you think it is that in this post-industrial society that you're depicting now, we can maybe return or learn from previous traditions and cultures.
Yeah, I mean, that, I guess it wasn't an idea that I set out to explore, although, as you say, it's probably a kind of arisen through the material that's there. But I mean, I was thinking about the fact that, you know, a lot of us these days are wandering around, you know, wearing merinos every day, you know, and wearing wool again. But there was a long period when it looked like the woolen industry was completely over because of synthetic fibres and their popularity. And we look now at the revival of Harris tweed. And there's something that we like in things that have gone through a quality process using materials that, you know, there was a really important reason that wool was as valued as it was, because it's a fantastic fibre for many reasons. And, you know, it's not just warm, but it's waterproof and hard wearing, and hence why tweed was worn on the hill, you know, by well, you know, in all sorts of scenarios, including war, but also for people who were trying to be camouflaged on the hill, which is how tweed came about, of course. And there is something about the sort of these processes and the craft qualities that we do seem to hanker after. And so that there's a sort of cyclical movement, but at the same time as consuming vast quantities of, you know, heavily manufactured goods as well.
Yeah.
So yeah, so I suppose, and in terms of the part of your question, which was about writing across different experiences, I suppose I've always felt that anything is material, you know, anything is game material. I think, you know, recently with the Black Lives Matter movement and the impact of that on writers, there's been some cause to question whether you can always write from somebody else's culture because of the risk of appropriation. So that's something that I do have to think about. But I've always maintained that if I want to write from a man's point of view, I can write from a man's point of view. And, you know, I wouldn't put anybody's experience out of bounds. It has to be carefully researched, isn't quite the right word, but I mean found out about, you know, and explored to make sure that your view is educated, I guess.
No, certainly, I agree. I mean, you do a lot of traveling to other parts of the world for writing workshops. Well, used to. That's sad. This is a celebration. Maybe we should put a pin in that for now. Yeah. So I suppose that experience of other cultures, I mean, that certainly shines through in the book, right? I mean, most obviously in the Lost Son chapter, but that's in kind of dedication to bridging cultures and to bridging traditions and belief systems is something that shines through. So I don't know if you would like to read a couple more excerpts now from the book.
Well, I'll read from an early part of the Catherine story, which is she's the suffragette. So this story is In and Out the Windows in January 1913. And she's early in the village, and she's establishing a relationship with this mill, which becomes her sort of best friend, possibly, and possibly not. I know them by heart now, your windows. 9 across the top floor, then 9 from right to left on your next, and so on to the bottom corner, 4 floors down. Counting's a fine way to pass the time, to take my mind off the cold, chewing my fingertips. In and out the windows, in and out the windows, in and out the windows, 1, 2, 3. I know your lines and wrinkles too, by sight, if not by touch. Those patches of oil staining your stone to black. The wee curve made in the stonework at the top of each window. It's just how I've got to know the laugh lines of John's face. It's from staring into it each night by the fire, when we measure our fingers against each other's. Under his nails, there's I the wool grease to scrape out, and under mine, the bannock dough, terrible stuff that sets solid like stone. It goes with this rattle. You hear? Aye. A box of matches in my apron pocket to show the proper wee country wife I'm becoming. We laugh about that in between talking about meetings I've been at, and women getting pelted with eggs and men's crude words for their trouble, all as if they were hers, not suffragettes. Aye then, play me your tune while I wait. Now, is it a jig or real? With the looms two-stepping on the first 2 floors, and then the whir of the twisting frames above. But the spinning mule, there on the top floor, that's harmony, eh? Making its wee dance with the operative as they slide in and out. And there's the river all solemn and slow behind you, not seeming to mind what you steal from it for your laid, and the splashing wheel that turns and turns at the same speed all day, till I find myself inside it, my eyes dropping shut with the turn and splash, turn and splash. What a joke, eh? That we chose you instead of a ship to Canada. Glunchy old you, sat still and sour-faced. I could just picture myself when I read the adverts on a sleek, shiny new ship. I'd be the one stood at the prow, cutting through the waves, the first to spy the land of opportunities. We went down to the Clyde even, saw one of them away. Folk were cheek by jowl on the decks, greeting and waving, and the noise was rising off them across the water, and the hankies all like wee blossoms shaken about in the March wind. It's you that's our ship now, a big, square, grey stone ship. So, where is it they're sailing to? Oh, can't hear you, Patrick. You're muted, Patrick.
Oh, I forgot I muted myself. Thanks for that. I was just saying there that you really, that you voice, the addressing of to the mill, it's really where she emerges as a character, isn't it? You know, he's immediately in opposition, and you get the sense that this is a character who emerges from opposition, from something to resist and something to battle against.
Yeah.
So I don't know if anyone has any questions they would.
Which I can see one now. That's Scots language.
You can just type them into the chat there. If you do, while we're waiting, I'll just say a little bit about ordering the book and how best to buy a copy. So, as Marion said, I would strongly encourage anyone to order from the Watermill. Certainly, if they're local, absolutely, and if they're inclined to otherwise, brilliant. You know, because independent publishers need independent bookshops and vice versa. You know, this is something that we really need to support each other with, and I feel incredibly privileged to have the Watermill be hosting this launch. It's an incredibly historic bookshop, so I would definitely encourage anyone to purchase the book from them if you're there. Otherwise, you can do so from our website, which is taprootpressuk.co.uk. I'll leave a little in the chat there as well for anyone who would like to visit. And we actually have a question as well from Liz. So from Liz Beavers, says, "Hello, Linda. Loved it, and now need to reread to catch all the themes." How did you come to the title?
Oh, with a lot of difficulty. I came across the piece of paper that I wrote all the different possibilities on some time ago, and I think I came up with that title before I wrote the final story. I know that Liz has read it, so that'll make sense to her. So when you've read the final story, it does have 2 meanings. But the thing, I think the thing that clinched the title for me was the feeling that there is running through the stories, that some characters are very much inside this building and are sometimes trapped in it. and some people are very much outside the building and not permitted to enter. And there's that kind of, so it felt to me that whichever side they're on, there's the other side, which has a particular meaning to them. But I did have quite a lot of different goes at the title. I should look for that bit of paper again, actually, because it's quite funny, the different ideas. The original novel, when it was a novel with only the 2 timelines, was going to be called Broken Symmetry, which has remained the title of one of the stories. Yeah, the 2006 story.
So we have a question from Sam Pyra. I apologize if I'm pronouncing the names incorrectly. They asked, do you consider the mill itself character?
I do, yes, yeah. And it's only defined by the view of the other characters of it. You know, that's the only way it's defined, because it can't speak for itself. But I think that was very important to me quite early on in writing, that it's almost the protagonist, in the sense that it's the thing that links all the characters. Mm-hmm. And because it's in a small village, and it's quite a sizable building for a small village, it's a sort of dominant force, whether it's working or whether it's falling down. You know, it's actually a monument in a way. Mm-hmm. So yeah, to me it did have and not, you know, I wouldn't go so far as to say it's either benign or the opposite, but it definitely had its own sort of feel and presence, particularly, I guess, defined by Catherine.
Mm-hmm. There's definitely a suggestion of haunting going on there, while never being explicitly supernatural. There is it has a presence from all the people who've lived in or out of it that kind of gathers this history, doesn't it? I do remember that when it first emailed us about the book, I'm sure you did describe the mill as the main character, so that's always been in my head from the first moment that I read the book. Cyril, and I can't see the name there. Helmet, there we are, thank you. Asks if we can mail the book to Australia, which we certainly can. I assume Marion can as well via the Watermill. Yeah, so that's no problem at all. If you order online, I'm sure we can do that for you. Kath has asked, how many other mill towns did you visit for the background for the stories? And how different were the workers and families in the big industrial mills compared to the small cottage industry mills?
I mean, I didn't visit. I've visited quite a lot through the years because of my past in a working wool museum, and so I did visit some Yorkshire ones when some were still functioning and some had been mothballed or had themselves been turned into museums. So I have visited over the years quite a few. And then there's the ones in the borders. But actually the patterns of the difference between what a Perthshire woolen mill might be like compared to one in the borders, I mostly gleaned by reading. And the significant differences were really that because the mills in Perthshire would have been much smaller, they may have done all the different processes. So in you know, you've got everything from washing the wool to carding it, to spinning it, to weaving it. And in a larger industrial setting, they would each of those processes would be separate buildings, and possibly even owned separately. Whereas in Perthshire, they could have all been under one roof. So that's a distinct difference. But also the other thing that I've referred to already, which was the fact that they didn't, despite the fact that, you know, going through these Perthshire advertisers in 1913-14, everybody was on strike. You know, the painters, the plumbers, the dyers, everybody was on strike at that time. You know, there was a lot of heat in unionisation. However, at the same time, there was a report from Haggart's, which was the local mill here, saying what a lovely time the whole family of employees and employers had together at their annual dance, and never a happier family, which is what gave me the idea for the fact that at this mill there would have been this quite paternalistic little mini society grown up around the fact that the employers were, you know, trying to help. Quite often this did happen, that the employers were trying to help their employees in various ways, but when crunch came, they might expect them to do more work for the same money, which is what led to the strikes.
Did you have, sorry, this is me now just jumping on that answer there, but did you have any one particular mill in mind for the model, the physical model, when you were imagining it, or was it kind of a conglomeration of?
Not really, it was a conglomeration, but it was fairly close to the one that I worked in Devon, but not quite the same. And that again was a mill which only did one thing, which was to spin worsted wool, and that was all it did originally. But it had 4 floors like this one does. It's probably a fairly similar size, but this one, it seemed to be important to me that the stairwell was in the centre. I don't know why. Don't ask me why. It seemed important.
Symbolism. So Fiona Ritchie has asked if you could talk a little about how being in buildings affects personally, their atmosphere and history, how you express that in your writing. Great event, thanks.
Yeah, I suppose I do notice interiors. I mean, I'm thinking that took me straight back to a Covenanter's house somewhere near Biggar that it's been turned into a museum, I seem to remember. And the thing that struck me there was some very old wooden railings, I think, alongside a staircase, almost like a banister, but more chunky than that. And the sense of all the people, because it was very beautifully worn timber, and there was a sense of all the hands that must have touched it over centuries. And likewise, you know, when I'm in Edinburgh sometimes in those little closes, and you see those hollow, oh, sorry, that's outdoors, but anyway, you could get it indoors. You get that hollowing in the steps where there's been so much foot traffic over years and years, and those kind of things have always captured my imagination. But I don't know. Thank you, Fiona, for the question, because it's made me think a bit. I wonder whether it's any different to how I feel when I'm outside, or whether I notice better when I'm outside. I'm not somebody who necessarily picks up supernatural vibrations, I don't think. I don't think I've ever experienced.
That you're aware of.
Not that I'm aware of.
So Muriel Dunbar has said that she's put a question directly to you about your use of Scots. I don't know if that's come through on your side. Or...
Yes, I can see it, yes. I found that very interesting, actually. The Scots. I mean, I did have help with the Scots more recently from Patrick and his father, which was really helpful, because I only ever wanted to suggest an inflection of Scots. I never had any ambition to write in Scots, but obviously as a non-speaker of Scots, I had to research individual words, and I think I did look back at what would have been more current, some of the words that would have been more current at that time, and which would have been in, if she'd come from the west of Scotland, would have been in her repertoire. But I think I wasn't that purist about it, and I think the main thing I wanted to give the impression of somebody speaking in a colloquial way, and with the colour of some of that language. And the point about it diminishing into the 21st century, I think that was something that you picked up on, Patrick, when you were editing, that you'd observed that. So, for example, Tom, the character who's the architect in Broken Symmetry, he's not very Scots at all. You know, he's not. There's certain words that you suggested wouldn't have been in his repertoire because he doesn't speak in Scots. So I guess it did get removed. I don't know. I suppose I'm interested in people's observations of that, because I was aware that I was writing in a language that isn't mine.
Yeah. I mean, I think that's certainly, I agree with that idea that it diminishes over time. The present day voice of Jade she's still kind of that Scots vernacular, but the modern day vernacular is almost an Americanized English in a way, an Americanized Scots English. It's very different to, say, Catherine from 100 years ago. So yeah, there's certainly that. you just hear that on a daily basis walking around, really, don't you? That the Scots has changed and, yeah, questionably diminished, certainly over time, I think. Imogen Carris has asked, what was the mill in Devon and is it still going as a knitter? So personal investment in this question.
Hello, Imogen. Yes, it's still going, amazingly, 40 years on. So I was there right at the, it had very recently closed. It was my first job after university, 1982, I think. And it had been abandoned still with a lot of archaic spinning equipment in it, a water wheel, a fabulous steam engine, all just there, sitting there. And it's called Cold Harbour Mill, now working museum, in a small village called Ufcombe, which is near Columpton, just off the M5 actually. And I must go back. I haven't been back for many years, but I see, it's still very active. And I started work there as a general labourer on an employment scheme, a bit like Jade, and graduated to being their education officer, and was able to do one of the highlights for me was doing a theatre and education project with a local teacher education college with their drama students. And I see that they're still doing theatre and education on the site, which is a great joy to me.
So we have two more here, and I think we'll probably have to leave it at that. It's 7 minutes to 8, so we'll go through these two and then probably call it an evening. How does that sound, Linda? Is that okay?
That sounds good.
So from Iona Liddle, she has asked if you could talk about your use of otherworldly images running through at different times. She says this seems to lend itself to the culture of the place over time.
Otherworldly. I'm just trying to think when it becomes otherworldly. I guess if that refers to sort of slightly folkloric elements, that's quite common in most of my writing. Actually, I don't seem to be able to avoid looking for if I'm looking at a stone or a manufactured object or a plant. Then I often do a little bit of research around something scientific about it, but also I kind of want to know the beliefs about it in the past. And it feels like a real grounding to me then. I feel like I know something more genuine about it once I've done that little bit of extra work. And yeah, it's hard for me to say, I suppose, whether that adds anything to the reading experience, but certainly for the writing experience, it feels like a different way of knowing something. And perhaps coming back to your point earlier, Patrick, from a different period, which I suspect has quite a lot of value. So if there was a particular thought about a plant, for some reason I've been thinking about crottle, which was a common a lichen, I think, used in dyeing, particularly of Harris tweed. But the reason that I'd come across it recently is because I've been writing about seafaring, and certainly in the Hebrides, you would never go to sea wearing something that with crottle, because it's very much of the land, and that would be very bad luck. So those things, I just find those kind of things intriguing and grounding for me, and reflecting a historical belief, which is still there enough somewhere that I think we are still believers in those things to some extent.
Mm-hmm. Yes, as you say, it goes back to that idea of kind of blending myth with history and different belief systems over different periods of time, which I certainly agree with Iona. I think lends to this culture of place, and over a great period rather than just in a specific moment. So lastly, from Fiona and Carol, they have asked, they've said, hi, I'll read this out because it's lovely. Hi, Linda. You always write very succinctly, beautifully, and do extensive research. Is there any character or scene that you had to leave out as it didn't quite fit the narrative?
I had to rule out, did you say? Leave out.
Is there, a character or scene that you had to leave out because it didn't quite fit?
Oh, well, lots of scenes. A whole novel, really. There was an awful lot, particularly of the contemporary story about the architect. I mean, that was a whole novel's worth that came down to that one that came down to that one story, which just became unnecessary to tell everything once I thought of it more like a short story. I didn't need all the backstory that I'd written. But apart from that, and there was a lot more of Catherine, actually, there's a lot more of Catherine's story. Maybe I should release a post-print short story, because there's a lot more of Catherine, some other events and episodes. So yeah, there's a lot more of her, but a bit in the spirit of short story writing, it is as much what you leave out as what you put in, and unless there was a really good reason for it to be there, I had to be ruthless. And it was much easier to do that after a long time of not looking at it. I mean, I've written several different things in the meantime, so it had a long rest when I could look at it a bit more as if someone else had written it and be quite ruthless with it. So yeah, lots left out, more left out than is in it, actually.
Well, you have the suggestion of a sequel here from Elizabeth Layton, so and a director's cut as well. So
director's cut, yeah.
Maybe you could use one of the alternative titles for it there. Put it to good use.
Yes.
Okay, great. So thank you so much, everyone, for all 100 of you for coming and listening. That's just fantastic that so many of you turned out and that we managed to do this. Huge thank you to Marion and to the Watermill for organizing this, and it's been great for me to meet Linda face to face,
yes,
or screen to screen for the first time.
I'm actually just looking at everyone to see who's there, because I haven't been able to look properly before. So it's so nice to see so many lovely people. Hello everybody. Oh, that's lovely. Can I sorry, is that Marion? Sorry,
yeah,
I can't see you.
Just say thank you to everybody for turning up, and we will try and do a kind of signing at some point when we're back in business and life has changed a bit. We're hoping the Watermill will be open again on the 26th of April. You can still click and collect this now if you need to get the book, which I strongly advise. But we're hoping to do maybe a garden signing. So even if you've got a book already and you haven't had it signed, if you look out for our social media, and we'll keep you posted as to when we're going to do that. So thanks very much to everybody, and obviously thanks to Linda and Patrick for doing all the talking. I'll pass it back.
Could I just, I'd like to raise a toast, if everybody's got anything to drink, well, I think, Taproot Press is extraordinary to have set up in this particular period when life's been so difficult, and it's a very bold thing to do, and to be already producing, beautiful books. I think it's fantastic. And also to the Watermill for being a brilliant neighbour and a great literary friend on my doorstep. So I don't know if we would break Zoom if we all turned our microphones on and just raised a glass and shouted or cheered or something, but should we try?
That's a great idea. Let's test this capacity.
Congratulations. Well done.
Congratulations.
Brilliant, Linda.
Thank you.
Well done, Linda.